Hi, and today I wanted to speak about ethical monotheism. What does that mean? Now, I know it's a popular phrase that people toss out in terms of what Jews are trying to promote in the world. They'll say that as Jews, we don't feel obligated to proselytize or encourage Gentiles to become Jewish or to adopt Torah completely. However, we do feel obligated to bring them into ethical monotheism. And the conversation typically stops there. I mean, it sounds nice, but what does it really mean? And to really answer that question, we have to know what classifies being ethical. What does being ethical mean towards Gentiles from a Jewish perspective or a modern day Jewish perspective? Because clearly, if you ask, are Jews and Gentiles held to the same standard of ethics? The modern day Jew would say absolutely not. But yet they still call it ethics, which at least only knowing that we're using the same word to classify what makes, one could say, humanity ethical, that sounds reasonable. But right when someone acknowledges that the person or rabbi proposing the idea of spreading ethical monotheism amongst Gentiles is actually encouraging them to some different standard, to some lesser standard, that's where the confusion begins. And you know what? You're right to be confused because it doesn't make sense. In other words, if being ethical is not a notion that's universally understood, i.e. as applicable to one man as it is to every man, then we have redefined what ethics means based and as applicable to individuals because of their pedigree. And that's really what I want to try to explore today. Friends, when the average person in the Jewish world mentions ethics for the world, there are a handful of preconceived notions that come into play here. Now, all these ideas are post the Torah, or came after the Torah, because according to the Torah, there's only really one standard of ethics. Now, truth be told, the Torah does not make a distinction, essentially, between what we would consider today ethical precepts versus ceremonial precepts. In other words, according to the Torah's language, from the Creator's perspective, as presented in Torah, breaking Shabbat is seen as unethical, as mistreating an orphan. At least at the outset, one could begin to gauge the severity of certain actions based on the punishment they have attached to them, i.e. the greater the punishment, the greater the infraction. But that aside, it seems that according to the 5 books of Moses alone, there seems to be only one standard for humanity, which are contained solely through the transmission that we received from our teacher Moses. And that's it, really. However, that does not encapsulate Judaism as a whole. Although the Torah is the base of our religion, although it's the only portion of our religion that we consider absolutely objective, Judaism is made up of other different components. And I'm particularly speaking about what we call halakha, Jewish law. Now, many times these halachot, these rulings from our great court, are enveloped within what's called midrash and agadah, basically folklore and legend. And within this folklore, we find many statements, symbolic, poetic, hyperbolic statements that try to embellish certain concepts. And one of those statements includes the idea that a Gentile, by only keeping 7 laws, is to be considered righteous, or in other statements, is considered righteous by the Almighty. And that is the guide that's used by the average day Jew in who and how they consider someone without a Hebraic pedigree or who hasn't converted to the Jewish religion righteous or ethical. But the bigger question is, where did this notion arise from? Because it's for sure not in the 5 books of Moses, which is, I must tell you again, the basis of our religion. No, friends, the notion that if someone keeps 7 laws, that this individual is considered righteous, came from where virtually every mystical, metaphysical notion arrives from in our religion. And that's off the back of a practical law, of a practical precept. For example, a Jew is required to believe that what we call the 7 laws of Noah was a code developed by the court to adjudicate Gentiles living on Jewish lands. Individuals known as Gerim Toshavim, foreigners or strangers residing amongst us. Because it's clear, if someone hasn't accepted the law, how could the court, the Sanhedrin, find cause for adjudicating these strangers against that law? So it was this notion that took on an embellished, hyperbolic, even metaphysical twist that led to the idea that yes, from a micro perspective, this is what allowed the Gentile to reside amongst Israel. That then, from a macro perspective, this concept might also have celestial repercussions. And thus, the notion that first existed to establish the notion of a docile Gentile amongst Israel came to be known as a standard that makes Gentiles righteous. And it was really, like many other things in our religion, something that was born out of unfettered semantics. How? Well, because the notion of being righteous, i.e. being fit to, in this case, reside amongst Israel, was a legal precept, clearly a rabbinic precept that did not appear in the 5 books of Moses. In other words, it taught, if you extract anything metaphysical from it, of someone in some way being given some share in the world to come, it taught that this individual was fit to reside amongst Israel. Like everything legal that gets twisted to a metaphysical level, this notion of being fit on earth began to be taught as being fit in heaven. I mean, that's really how modern-day Judaism works. Virtually every metaphysical concept that's not clearly laid out in the 5 books of Moses began as a legal, halachic precept, i.e. a rabbinic precept, that was then carried into a metaphysical level, but a man-made metaphysical level. Because that's really what makes up Judaism today. The split between ideas and precepts that appear in the Torah and ideas and precepts developed by the rabbis. This is nothing new. Anyone who studies rabbinic literature will constantly be confronted with rabbis constantly making a distinction between the rabbinic and what appears in our Torah. The problem is that today people fail to make that distinction, and that has given birth to what we call the Noahide movement today. You can test that hypothesis yourself. Go up to the average Noahide and see if he can make a distinction between rabbinic ideas and ideas that appear in the Torah. Of course not, because if he could, he would not remain a Noahide. And this is why the notion of ethical monotheism, or the preaching thereof, should really be redefined in the Jewish world. And unless it is redefined, we will keep on misleading people by making them think that rabbinic ideas, that what they believe and what they practice, which are ultimately later developed rabbinic ideas, are also found in the Torah, or even have their roots in the Torah, which is not the case. And this is why ethical monotheism equals Torah Judaism. You cannot separate the two. In other words, full Torah Judaism, not extracting a portion for one segment of humanity or another ethnic subclass. In order to be considered ethical by the Torah, you have to keep every law in the Torah. And yes, it is the job of the Jewish people to envelop this planet with this notion. And friends, you can even test this hypothesis. Go up to the average individual and ask him, do you think that someone, especially in our day and age, would be considered righteous by only keeping 7 laws? Of course not. The notion is preposterous, especially righteous enough to be rewarded with some celestial afterlife. Now, far be it from me to say who should receive what in the afterlife, but it seems that if one is only required to live by 7 laws in order to be considered righteous in God's eyes, then the notion of righteousness really doesn't mean much. Now they may say, well, it's more than 7 laws, but this notion of more than 7 laws was really developed much, much later. Because as you're thinking now, the rabbis also thought it preposterous to only offer 7 laws and think that this is what consider them righteous. Yes, this is what consider them docile, and possibly righteous in the terms of fit or satisfactory under the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. In other words, yes, this is what we want Gentiles to be doing, but not into the later twisted notion of satisfactory from a Torah perspective or from God's perspective. In other words, what we want Gentiles to be doing, because throughout history, Gentiles, or people who did not have Torah, were not held to a high level, i.e. much was not expected from them. Friends, for more information on everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.com. Thank you.